Hello, all, and welcome to the December UN Info session. My name is Madison Barnes, and I am here representing the San Diego chapter of the United Nations Association. The United Nations Association San Diego chapter is a grassroots civil society organization dedicated to the promotion of local engagement with the United Nations. The San Diego chapter was established in 1946 and works to translate the initiatives established by the UN into a more local context. On November 25th, it was International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, which launched a 16-day global advocacy campaign against gender-based violence. For our live info session, we are discussing the ways that the San Diego community can reduce violence against women in regards to gun violence. This initiative is in line with Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality, and further, Goal 5.2 is to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres. I will be moderating this discussion between our panelists, attorney Jeff Brooker, Jennifer Golan, and Carol Landale, representing the organization San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. I'm so glad that you guys were all able to join me today. I have some questions for you regarding our gun policies in relation to domestic violence in San Diego. But first, starting with Carol, tell us a little bit about your organization and your background. Oh, I think you're muted.
Carol Landale, and I am the Executive Director for San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. And we're a coalition. We came together in 2018, led by members from Brady United Against Gun Violence, a national organization, and Moms Demand Action. So since we came together, we now have 13 other organizations that include faith and community organizations, a couple of youth groups, Team Enough, which is an outreach of Brady, and March for Our Lives are also part of our coalition. And we work with two local violence prevention groups, Shafat Outreach and Community Wraparound. We also have, we work with Survivors Empowered, which is a national group working with survivors of gun violence. So the way our coalition works, we have monthly meetings. And last month we had the most fascinating presentation from Jeff Brooker, who you'll be hearing from later on. Every month we have a different speaker. This coming month, we will be joined by, by the director from Kitchens for Good, which is a local organization that provides apprenticeship programs for those overcoming the impacts of incarceration, homelessness, and foster care. So part of what we're doing is working with these organizations that are violence prevention organizations, because if we can get to the root cause of gun violence, we are halfway there, because just putting Band-Aids on the problem is not necessarily going to be successful. We need to look at it from all directions. We have three teams that we work with. We have an education, legislation, and an outreach team. And the education team right now is working on an initiative for school safety, urging schools to send home information to parents about the California safe storage laws. We have the legislative committee that is working with the San Diego Board of Supervisors on a ghost gun ban, safe storage, and funding violence intervention. And we have an outreach team, which is currently planning an annual vigil. This is something we've done every year since Sandy Hook in 2012 to remember the children and all of the victims of gun violence since then. So looking forward to next year, again, focusing on intervention. We will be working with the California Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant Program, helping communities in San Diego apply for these grants. It's a fairly lengthy process, so we want to advertise the availability of the grants and get more people to apply. And here's some good news. This year, Governor Newsom approved $200 million for violence intervention. So again, back to the intervention, and then from there, let's get rid of some of the guns that are in the hands of wrong people.
Thank you so much, Carol. And on to City Attorney Jeff Brooker. Please introduce yourself and your expertise.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay first? Because I had to jump off my computer and jump on my phone because it wasn't working. Apologize for that. So thank you. My name is Jeffrey Brooker. I'm a deputy city attorney working for the city attorney's office here in San Diego. I work currently as a supervisor in the gun violence response unit, where I've spent the last 3 years essentially filing gun violence restraining orders against those individuals who represent a danger to self or others. I also do firearm destruction petitions resulting from domestic violence contacts by police when firearms are seized, whether or not a case is issued. And before that, I worked in the domestic violence and sex crimes unit as a prosecutor for the city attorney's office for a couple of years. And prior to that, I was a deputy district attorney, where again, I prosecuted pretty much cases at every level involving domestic violence and or firearms. So that's my background and that's what I do now.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
Thank you. So I'm an investigative reporter. My name is Jennifer Golan, and I work for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. We're one of the largest nonprofit investigative units in the country, and we partner with different media organizations on cross-platform work. So digital pieces, radio pieces that air on more than 500 NPR stations on Reveal's radio show, and also television documentaries. Our most recent investigation exposed how America's gun laws allow abusers to keep their guns with deadly consequences. I analyzed data from 21 states, took all of the domestic violence homicide data, collected it, analyzed it, backgrounded all of the perpetrators to pinpoint a group that had killed their partners, even though they were legally barred from having firearms. And we took our findings to the ATF and to lawmakers in Washington. And it was a cross-platform project that aired on Fault Lines, which is Al Jazeera's documentary film program, and Reveal. And we also partnered with The Guardian. So our digital piece appeared there in October. And we're continuing this series into America's gun laws and abusers. And we'll be coming out with some other pieces in the coming weeks.
Thank you. Thank you guys so much for your efforts and stuff with your organizations, as well as introducing yourselves. On to our questions for you guys. Carol, this will be for you. Is there evidence that links less restrictive laws on gun ownership and storage to a higher violence against women rating?
Well, in short, the answer is yes. And I think the way I can best illustrate this, if I can share my screen, I'll do that right now, is with this map, which shows states that have strong gun laws and they're called gun-friendly, the gun-friendly states. And it also shows the number of people who die, and this per 100,000. So you can compare California, 3.5 gun deaths per 100,000. And I think this was from 20 through 2016. And compare that with some of the states that are in red that have a 5-star rating for gun friendliness. And sure enough, the death toll is higher. Now this is overall. So I'll stop my screen share. I'll leave that for a minute. This is overall, but we also have to look at how these statistics affect women. Thank you for turning that off. So what I'd like to do is just compare two states, Alaska, which is #1 in gun deaths, and California, which is where we are obviously living. So some of the gun laws in Alaska, I should say some of the lack of gun laws in Alaska. Alaska has no background checks on private sales. California does. It has no child access prevention laws. California does. It has no extreme risk prevention orders, which in California are referred to as gun violence restraining orders, which I know that Jeff is going to be talking about later on. There's no restriction on high capacity magazines. And I think perhaps the most important, there is no law that prohibits convicted domestic abusers from accessing weapons. As you might expect, Alaska has the highest homicide rate in the country for women killed by male perpetrators. And I know both Jeffrey and Jennifer are into statistics, and so put me right if I have a few things wrong there. So moving to California, where California has the strongest gun laws of any state, we still have high gun deaths. We're number 7 in the country as far as gun deaths, but we do have strong gun laws. And I think the gun laws in California that favor protecting women are things like the 10-day waiting period. So a domestic abuser cannot just go out, buy a gun, and come back and shoot his victim. There's some cooling off time required. There is the extreme risk protective order, which is the GVRO, that allows a person to have a gun removed if that person is in crisis. Again, this is very good protection for women. And there's also the domestic violence restraining order, which I know that Jeffrey will be talking about as well later on. This requires somebody accused of domestic violence to relinquish the gun. Now, I understand that this is not always happening, that it's not very well enforced, but the good news is that there's just been passed into law, SB 320, which is a bill that will strengthen the ability for courts to make sure that the guns are removed from domestic offenders. So, that's just 2 states, but I think it gives a comparison, especially if you look at the map. And that's it.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciated that comparison actually with the higher gun laws that we have in California versus, of course, Alaska. So this is for Jeffrey Brooker. What is the connection in San Diego between gun violence and domestic abuse? Are specific groups disproportionately affected by this?
It's a 2-pronged question. So the first one, as far as the connection between San Diego, between gun violence and domestic abuse, without getting too lost in the weeds here, I want to just give a context to that prong first. And that context is going to come in the form of 3 statistics, because that's a very important backdrop to the answer that you're about to get. And the first statistic is, and this is a national stat, that when there's a gun in the home of a domestic abuse situation, the increase of homicide goes up by 500%. That's stat 1. Stat 2 that I want to cite is that the most frequent method of DV, domestic violence homicides, is shooting, and accounts for just less than half of all DV homicides. So there we have that tie. And then the third stat I want to bring to your attention is that a woman's or any victim of a domestic abuse homicide, the risk is highest when they're either trying to end the relationship or shortly thereafter, within about a week or 2. And 45% of all domestic violence homicides occur within a 90-day window of the separation or attempted separation period, most being within the first couple of days. And we've seen situations in San Diego where homicides have occurred just by result of the obtaining of a restraining order in the domestic violence realm. So with those 3 things in mind, let's look at San Diego for a second. and ask ourselves, when it comes to the connection, what are the three ways to either protect victims or hold abusers accountable? And the first one is obvious. That's crime. Charge it as a crime. And if you charge it as a crime, there can be incarceration. There could be criminal protective orders put in place. There can be probation and everything in between that goes along with that criminal process. That's one way. The second way would be through Your Safe Place, a family justice center, where the victim doesn't go through police, but they go through that side of it, looking for safety, looking for services. This is where they can obtain domestic violence TROs. This is where they can get safety plans. This is where they can get education on all the different resources of relocation or what have you, in order to help themselves in that regard. And then there's the third way, which is the gun violence restraining order method or avenue, so to speak. And this is a order that can be filed by a victim or an immediate family member, but is most frequently filed by police against the abuser in order to separate them from their guns. Now, there are gaps and exceptions that still allow for the compromising of the safety and still do not hold full accountability in all three of these methods. They're not perfect in and of themselves, and they're not going to stop the problem in and of themselves. But they are the most common three ways to protect or hold to account. What San Diego's done, what we've done, is we've combined all three into one screening mechanism. So all three of these catch-alls are funneled in every way. So if something just goes to the crime side and it doesn't pass muster, it doesn't pass go, we don't have to worry about it also not being checked for a GVRO or also not being checked for a civil TRO. And that same sort of check and balance goes with all three. And we've combined them by adding the GVRO screen into the Your Safe Place intake system when a victim comes in looking for help or looking for services. Now they're screened not only for GVRO potential, in addition to the TRO and everything that they come there to try to obtain, but also we can turn that into a possible crime case as well when they might not have otherwise reported it to the police because they're too afraid. And we can put a different avenue to that end in place through that mechanism of intake. A GVRO is the same way. They say they come in, or the police come to us and say, hey, we think there's a lot of red flags here and we think this person shouldn't have guns. I then have the option to refer this victim to Your Safe Place if they don't know it exists. So if they don't do a GVRO or we don't do a crime, they can then go try to get their own services that way. Or in the alternative, I can refer what I know that's already been reported right to the police domestic violence unit, because we have an officer embedded in our unit, to say, hey, what do you think? There's a crime here. So we can immediately get charges filed, take it to our criminal division, see if it can be proven, and we go from there. So what have we done in San Diego? We've connected all three of these so that people who only avail themselves of one of these mechanisms or two of these mechanisms, now automatically by going to any one of these, they're caught up with all three. And it's really in the weeds and detailed how they correlate and interact. And I can go on for hours literally about that, but that's kind of a big picture sense of that connection. When it comes to the disproportionality of who's affected, I guess that also kind of takes two prongs if you really break it down. Are we talking about the affected being the abusers, in which case we're removing their guns, or through a TRO we're restricting their rights in some way or their liberties, or through crime, incarceration or further restrictions on their liberties? Or are we talking about the victim? And are certain victims getting treated differently or disproportionately than others when they are abused by in domestic violence relationships? And all I can really say on that is, the crimes are only as good as who's reporting them and bringing them to the police's attention. The same with the gun violence restraining orders. And by default, anyone who goes to Your Safe Place or the Family Justice Center to seek help or services, everybody's treated the same. So I don't know if there's any stats on that side as far as who's affected or not from the victim side. It's just that if you are a victim of any type of domestic relationship, whether it be same sex, or whether it be elder abuse, whether it be child abuse, whether it be any form of family violence, all the victims go through the same process. And when it comes to the disproportionality of the abuser, I don't know the stats on the crime side, but or the Your Safe Place, because that's more victim geared. But I can say that for gun violence restraining orders, statistically, of the hundreds that we filed, over 700 cases that we filed, it's typically Caucasian males in their mid-40s. And the minority group that's hit by GVROs, at least by our office, is a very, very small portion of those cases that we file on. So it rubs against a lot of the law enforcement disproportionality of enforcement statistics that I know are out there. But for some reason, that just seems to be the cases that we catch and the cases we review and screen. So if there's a disproportionate effect in that, I don't know what it is, because again, we're only as good as the cases that come to us. We can't just pick and choose who we want to file on. They all come in as referrals. And we're only as good as those referrals at the end of the day when it comes to statistics and numbers. So I think that is probably my best attempt to answer that question.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Jennifer, this is for you. How has increased gun ownership rates in COVID-19 affected violence against women?
Sure. So this year we saw, for a second year in a row, a record number for gun sales. Researchers are loath to take any one factor and attribute it to the increase in gun violence that we've also seen. But folks like Dr. James Allen Fox, he's a criminologist at Northeastern, said this could be one of the factors that we should consider. And the numbers, as far as the number of gun-related domestic violence homicides, speak for themselves. They reached a 26-year high last year, and the number of gun-related domestic violence homicides jumped just 25% in 2020 versus the year before, with the onset of the pandemic and the record number of gun sales. So we know that the numbers are up, and we also know that 2/3 of those killed in 2020 were women. So these are serious, these are numbers that point to a serious public health crisis.
Thank you. I appreciate those statistics too. Also, another question, women are often afraid to report on their abusers. What are some of the leading risk factors for women who are in abusive relationships that you found?
Well, the presence of a gun has a deterrent effect. We found through talking with different survivors that there are often, and reviewing cases where women had been victims of abuse and were later killed by abusers who shouldn't have had guns. They feared that reporting their abuse to police would further antagonize their abusers. And they were reluctant to report that, in some cases, that their abusers had a gun. And in the cases where they did, police didn't always take that gun away. And there were different nuances to these cases, but sometimes the police couldn't get the local prosecutor's office to actually get a search warrant and arrest somebody. And that person was later killed. So there are all kinds of factors, but some of the top factors are that abused victims are afraid to report to police, and especially women of color do not often want to report their abuse to police for obvious reasons.
And Jennifer, what would you say you recommend to a woman to prevent that sort of case of, say she doesn't want to go to the police or something, or she has before and they haven't done anything, what would you say that she should do?
Well, in talking to some of the families, what they wish their loved ones had done is get away. Basically to move out, to find somewhere else to go. And, they often say it takes, breaking up an average of 7 times. But in many of these cases, I think their loved ones, their surviving family members, wish they had gotten away sooner.
Thank you so much. Carol, what are California's firearm restrictions on domestic violence offenders, and how effective are they?
Well, the two that I think are the most obvious are the domestic violence restraining orders and the gun violence restraining orders. And I mentioned the DVROs earlier, that prevents a person who is a domestic violence offender from having a gun. The difficulty with that is it's on the honor system. So that offender it's up to him to turn in his gun. And as I mentioned earlier, that is going to change. There's going to be more follow through with the passage of the Senate Bill 320 that is going to require the courts to follow through and make sure that that firearm is turned in. So with the loopholes in the DVRO, I think that right now it's the gun violence restraining order that's probably the most effective, because as Jeff mentioned earlier, that allows law enforcement to remove a gun from somebody who is threatening violence. And the good thing about the GVRO is the person being threatened doesn't necessarily have to appear. It's filed by the police department, and so the abusee, can remain behind the scenes.
Thank you. And Jeff, is there a policy or reform you would add to the California legislature to reduce violence against women?
Oh, there's always things I would add to all of this stuff, but and just to kind of also piggyback on Jennifer and Carol's points that they just made, a perfect example, just to kind of give a real life illustration here of how this goes down in context is, a victim will try to get a DVTRO. And because they're afraid, or any of the reasons that Jennifer mentioned, they don't follow through with it, or it never gets served, or there's retaliation for filing that declaration when the abuser's name is on the actual filing. I'm sorry, the victim's name is on the filing. The victim writes under penalty of perjury, these are all the bad things this guy does to me. And then it's public, it's served, and then now he has to go to court. There's a high degree of potential for retaliation or lashing out, or it just never gets served in the first place. Or anyone who's ever worked in the prosecutorial realm of domestic violence knows there's such a high degree of the victim recanting at every different stage of this. So what can happen is the alternative to that can be a gun violence restraining order. Insofar that, as Carol just mentioned, the victim's name is not on it. It's not victim against perpetrator, it's police against perpetrator in a civil realm, not a criminal realm. And when it's the police's case, it's a lot more likely to get served. And although it does not restrict the liberty of the person being around the victim, that also, in a sense, protects the victim from that retaliation, because they say it's not you doing this against me, it's the police doing this against me. And most importantly, the gun is removed from the equation. And that's the sole purpose. And there is no lag on that. There is no honor system for them to do. The police go and they take it. And if they do not give it up, the search warrant is executed right there on scene, and they're held until it's executed. And so there's a lot more fail-safes involved that can protect a victim, or to remove the gun. It's kind of tied into the last two questions, so I just thought I would add that to show and illustrate an example. To your question, what I would add, and this is kind of an indirect modification, but I thought real hard on this, and this could just be the prosecutor in me too speaking, former prosecutor. But I think the problem is the way California has decriminalized so many things for the last 10, 15 years now and running at so many different levels. A lot of misdemeanor crimes were swept up in that. And the fact that we very rarely incarcerate on a lot of different types of misdemeanors as well also caught this gun violation misdemeanor in its wake. So thinking about the cases that we see in court and the different violations of people with TROs who possess firearms and never turn them in, when those get actually referred, you have to ask yourself, was he on notice? Was he served? How long ago was it? What was the gun registration law? Yada, yada, yada. But bottom line, he never turned it in. He or she never turned it in. So I think and it's on like page 3 or 4 of all the different dozens of orders that come with the DVTRO, and it's just lost in the wind. And you got to assume also that they're even in court to be told and to be served, because a lot of times they're not. They don't show up, and the default is ruled against them. The order goes out, and then they have to go get served again. Do they really read it all, word by word, line by line? Probably not. They just see the main part and the orders about staying away, distance, and places and locations and kids and whatnot. I think if we added one of 3 different types of penalties to the crime of possessing a firearm while prohibited by a DVTRO, you could do it in one of 3 ways. A, you can say, well, I think we should make this a felony wobbler case. So the DA has discretion of making this a felony if charged, because then the felony carries with it a lifetime prohibition on firearms and survives the life of the TRO. And it's a lot more severe consequence. So I think that's going to light a fire on a lot of these people with this honor system. I better turn my gun in because I don't want a criminal record. And I do care. I might not care about a misdemeanor record that doesn't prohibit me anyway if I'm violated, but I will certainly care if it's a felony. And I think that might be a deterrent. Option 2 would be to add a term of firearm prohibition length to the actual penalty itself. For example, in gun violence restraining orders, if you're actually caught in possession of a gun while prohibited by a gun violence restraining order, you get an extra 5 years of prohibition as a mandatory minimum sentence that must be imposed on all convictions for that misdemeanor. So now, if you take that into the DV side, you could say, well, even if my DV order is only for a year or only for 2 years, but if I violate by not turning my gun in, I'm going to have a gun prohibition for another 5 on top of that. It might make them think twice about turning that gun in, and we're selling it, transferring it, whatever. And that's option 2. Option 3, and this kind of goes back to the days when drugs used to be illegal and people used to go down for that and not go into diversion or some sort of help program. When I first started doing this in 2000, long time ago, there was a 90-day mandatory minimum incarceration sentence for all people under the influence of a controlled substance in public. So if you were, it's a Health and Safety Code 11550. This is how it used to be. And I'm just using this as an example. There's no longer that 90-day mandatory minimum. But if you added a mandatory minimum incarceration period on that crime and keep it a misdemeanor, people who've never been to jail before, people who are only dealing with this on the civil side, but now they violate on the misdemeanor crime side, everyone usually goes, who cares? I'll get a misdemeanor slap conviction. I'll get it expunged later. Big deal. But if there's a mandatory jail sentence that goes with that, for which would realistically be 45 days serving half time, I think a lot more people would be a lot more inclined to turn in those guns. So from a statutory standpoint, I look at sometimes a punishment can be a deterrent, but it would certainly, if nothing else, it would put the gun prohibition at the forefront of the TRO as a major consequence if you violate, not as some possible back burner down the road. If it were to be violated, and if it were to be prosecuted, you could be liable for something that still won't keep you from prevent you from possessing guns. That's what I would add.
Thank you. Wow, that's I was not expecting that. That was actually very I really liked that information on that. And to any of the panelists, actually, what are some resources or programs as an alternative to police that are available for women undergoing domestic abuse or gun violence?
I just wanted to give someone else.
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Okay, I would offer that the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available as a resource. And you can call 24 hours a day, every day, around the clock throughout the year.
Thank you, guys. And
Also, say any family justice center or your safe place here in San Diego, any type of shelter or hotline in the local area should always be used, because they might not be able to help you directly, but they can certainly have resources to direct you to that can. So.
perfect, thank you. And as a community, what should our #1 priority to reduce violence against women in San Diego be? And your guys' own opinions, of course.
Well, I think the #1 priority overall is to protect victims from domestic abuse. And I know that's very cliche, and that can take a lot of forms, and of course, easier said than done. But it's kind of like gun violence awareness. Everyone always asks, how do we reduce gun violence? You know, how do we reduce domestic violence? And it's kind of like the homeless question. How do we stop homelessness? There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that kind of a question. It's going to come through education, and it's going to come through reforms that chip away at that problem. And I think once you chip away long enough and hard enough, you're going to actually start gaining ground on that prevention side of the either gun violence or domestic abuse. And so hand in hand with that is education. The more people that are aware of the resources for help, and the bigger the issue is culturally, the more likely the problem will be stemmed, because more resources will be dumped into fixing that problem. The bigger it is, the louder it is, and the more awareness and education that's out there. So there's a lot of things we can do, but you just have to be vigilant and diligent in order to see it through, understanding that it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all quick fix type of solution.
I think one of the things that struck me through this whole reporting process, one of the things I've learned from researchers and prosecutors and police, is this strong connection and association between intimate partner violence and general gun violence in the community. And, you know, there's a strong tie with mass shootings, with intimate partner violence and abusers, suicide, also tied to intimate partner violence. So there are a number of gaps that we have found in the reporting process to address intimate partner violence that would have a ripple effect on gun violence. One of them is that there's a huge gap in federal law. The 1968 Gun Control Act and subsequent laws that protected abuse victims from people with criminal convictions don't lay out specific procedures for how people should relinquish their guns if they receive a disqualifying conviction. And number two, the federal government does not track the number of people killed by people who are legally barred from having firearms. And unless we have the data, we really can't have an informed policy discussion or put resources or laws into place that will actually address the problem. It's hard, you know, we need to quantify what the problem is instead of going off of anecdotal evidence. So those are just some of the things that I've learned through this reporting process that have been incredibly eye-opening.
Thank you so much. Oh, Carol, did you want to say something?
Well, no, I was just going to add that getting information to women about the resources is really perhaps the most important, because if they don't know, then how can they access the resources? That the Your Safe Place being one of them in San Diego. One of the things that our organization is doing right now is distributing information in the communities that are most affected by gun violence, giving that information. So if you find yourself in a domestic violence situation, the resources are there. So we are getting that out. And once women know about that, I think that, they can do something to help themselves. But, I'd also think that we need to help the abusers. We need to get to them. They're not necessarily, whatever their situation is, however they got to that point where they felt the need to be abusing their mate, there's something wrong with that. And I think, as Jeff mentioned, it's a societal issue that needs funding, needs resources to go to find out what's at the root of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you to all the panelists, Jeffrey, Jennifer, and Carol, for helping answer our questions, and also working with your organization and Jeffrey with the city for the safety of San Diego. We really appreciate it. I'm going to open this up to any questions that might come about from the audience, or if you guys have any more information that you'd like to share as well.
I'll add one more thing if there's not a question coming in. And looking at gun violence from the federal level, the background check we have a background check system right now, but it's antiquated. It needs to be updated. We've got 2 bills right now that have passed the House. And I think if we could get those through Congress, out of the Senate, where they're sitting at the moment, that would also be very helpful, because that way we can track, that would be preventing someone who is prohibited from buying a gun at the national level, not a state by state problem.
Thank you, Carol. And I do have a question from somebody. Do you think more women in Congress would impact in passing this law and new initiative?
I would hope so, but I don't know.
I no clue. I don't know the current landscape of breakdown in Congress and how they vote enough to be able to give that an adequate answer.
I could see there being a positive correlation between more women in Congress and impacting new passing of laws towards violence against women and stuff.
I'm sorry. I think, regardless of what your gender is, and having a seat in Congress, if you spent more time talking to domestic violence survivors and educating yourself on things beyond the sound bites and the pressers and things that come out, I think that would certainly have a positive impact, because until you live in the world and see the world through the victim's viewpoint and feel that danger and that sense of threat and fear, that certainly has a lasting effect on anybody. And if you're a policymaker, I can see how you'd slow down a little bit when you're going through those measures, understanding the ramifications on the other side.
I'd also add that, again, what I've seen through the reporting is it's not just abuse victims who are killed. Often it's children, police, random people who stepped in to help, security guards, for example. All kinds of different people are affected. And so it really is a problem, especially with people who have guns legally. It's a problem that affects everybody.
Thank you guys so much. we're going to go ahead and close it up right here, but we appreciate you guys answering our questions. And in the video's description, we'll include the SD4GVP social media handle, as well as Jennifer Golan's podcast that you do. Feel free to follow and take a look at the UNASD website and social media. We'd like to encourage